It's a pleasure to be back here at Columbia, and particularly in this room, where I might mention that 17 years ago, in January 1997, I chaired a meeting which was opened by then Dean of SIPA, Lisa Anderson, who is today president of the American University in Cairo, a meeting where we had a dialogue with the first delegation of the Taliban who came to the United States. This was a delegation that came to New York about 3 or 4 months after they had taken control of Kabul to ask the United Nations to give them Afghanistan's UN seat, not realizing, of course, that that was not within the power of the UN Secretary General. I might mention that the people who were there, the delegation was led by Wakil Ahmed Mutawakil, who later became their foreign minister and whom I saw in Kabul just a few weeks ago. He's one of the reconciled Taliban. I don't know if you have met him.
I have not.
And he was interned in Bagram for some time. Abdul Hakim Mujahid, who is currently a member of the Afghan High Peace Council in Kabul and also reconciled. Mullah Abdur Raqib, who was one of the few non-Pashtuns. He's an Uzbek from Takhar, who at that time was Minister of Refugees and who was assassinated in Peshawar a few weeks ago after returning from a confidential meeting in Dubai trying to start some kind of a peace process. And their interpreter at that meeting was Anwar al-Haq Ahadi, who later became the chairman of the central bank, the Minister of Commerce, and a presidential candidate in Afghanistan, and is very likely to be in the next cabinet. So this is a historic room, but it's really a pleasure to welcome Dipali, whom I met first at ISA, the International Studies Association meeting in San Diego many years ago, through a mutual friend, someone who used to work for me at Council on Foreign Relations, and you've just come back from ISA too.
That's right.
In Toronto. Let me start by referring to something that Jack mentioned, which was that I was on the UN delegation at the Bonn talks, which launched the process that led to the current government of Afghanistan after 9/11 and the U.S. decision to overthrow the Taliban regime. One of the issues that we faced at Bonn was how to cope with the fact that there were men on the ground leading armed groups, such as the main figures in your book, who later became governors, Gul Agha Sherzai and Muhammad Atta, who some people called warlords. There was a question how whether they should be incorporated, whether they should be held accountable. There were issues about whether there should be an amnesty for war crimes or not. I might mention one person who isn't here today, the head of one of the sponsoring organizations, Jean-Marie Guéhenno, was at that time the Undersecretary General of the UN for Peacekeeping Operations. And before Bonn, after a meeting that I attended in the State Department on September 24th as an outside expert, along with someone you'll be hearing a lot more about in the coming few days, namely Ashraf Ghani, a meeting chaired by Richard Haas, whom you now may see on Morning Joe. I went to see Jean-Marie in his office at the UN to tell him that as a result, my conclusion from this meeting at the State Department was that the UN might be asked to send a peacekeeping force to Afghanistan, or at least to Kabul, to maintain the capital free of the influence of those armed men on the grounds, the warlords, so that a non-military political process could develop, which is one of the classic problems, of course, in coming out of a civil war. And he blanched, of course. And as it turned out, of course, there was not a peacekeeping force, but a multinational force with the UN Security Council mandate. But you have had an extraordinary degree of access to and have done a really remarkable piece of research about the development of some of these figures that people called warlords. And I wonder if you could reflect a bit on the dilemma of accountability, demilitarization, and how to cope with such people as a country is transitioning from a civil or transnational war to, I don't know what to call it, I shouldn't say peace, but to a greater degree of civility and political legitimacy.
Yeah, well, let me just start by saying what a huge privilege it is to share these two comfy armchairs with you, Barney, because your work on Afghanistan, for all of us who have studied it since, has been sort of the central set of texts that we start with. So to be here and get to talk about my book with you is really a thrill. So I think the conundrum or the central dilemma that you present about the presence of these actors, the fact that they were partners of the US military, and then the question of, quote, what to do with them after the Taliban fell, that was sort of the central question that animated the writing of this book. And for me, I guess it comes down to a question of definition first. So I think if you define warlords as predatory spoilers who are seeking gains at the expense of the state building project and the creation of peace and good governance, then it's very difficult to make an argument that they should not be marginalized. If, on the other hand, you define them, and this is how I define them in the book, as leaders at the national and subnational level of particular factions, of particular constituencies that have military might of certain amount, that have access to money and economic power, and that have social and political ties within their communities, then it's possible to understand them both as potential competitors in the state building project, but it's also actually possible to think of them as participants. And
before you go on with that discussion, I'd like to see if you could make this a little bit more concrete for people by giving us a portrait of the two main characters in your book, Muhammad Atta and Gul Agha Sherzai.
Sure. I have had the...
And by the way, of course, the chapter is about those two men, one of whom is currently the governor of Balkh in northern Afghanistan, and one of whom is currently the governor of Nangarhar, though he comes from Kandahar. The first are opened with very interesting pictures of you in their company.
Yeah, much like I said,
a group in which,
you.
well, you stand out in that group even more than you do sitting here with me.
That's true. Yes, I've had the very interesting experience of meeting both of these men on two different occasions each. So, the first is that I write about is Atta Mohammed Noor, who's currently the governor of Balkh. He's been the governor of Balkh now for coming up on a decade. He is a native of the province of Balkh and grew up there and joined the Mujahideen when he was a teenager to fight the Soviets, and then went on to fight the Taliban. And then, along with his longtime nemesis, Abdurrashid Dostum, joined the Americans to take Mazar-e-Sharif, the sort of central northern city, back from the Taliban in the fall of 2001. Gul Agha Sherzai, who has just finished his run for the presidency, and it looks like from the numbers he doesn't quite have a shot, which isn't really a surprise. But Gul Agha Sherzai comes from the southern province of Kandahar, same home province as President Karzai, and comes from the Barakzai tribe, which has a long legacy of rule and involvement in rule in Afghanistan. Sherzai helped the Americans take Kandahar, which was the center of gravity for the Taliban in 2001.
Or it might be said that the Americans helped Sherzai take Kandahar.
That's right. Depending on who you talk to, you might get a different description. And then he, I think it's fair to say, took the governorship of Kandahar for himself, and then then was appointed, then was taken out of Kandahar by President Karzai, then was sent back, and then was eventually in 2007, which is when my sort of story, sort of interest with him began, 2005 was then moved to Nangarhar and began his tenure there. which then